The wind tearing through the mountain pass did not sound like wind. It sounded like a woman screaming. Clara stood on the warped wooden planks of the trading post porch, her teeth clicking together so violently they ached. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against her chest, sinking its teeth through her threadbare grey shawl and the thin blue cotton of a dress meant for a gentle spring, not a Montana winter. The hem of her skirt was stiff with frozen mud, brushing heavily against oversized men's boots that offered no warmth. But the freezing air was only the second cruelest thing on that porch. The cruelest was the piece of paper nailed to the wooden post beside her. $30, Silas bellowed, his voice cutting through the howl of the storm. He was a large man, heavy with greed and cheap whiskey, his face flushed red in the light of the fire barrel burning in the center of the porch. $30 clears the uncle's gambling debt. You pay the tab, you get the paper. You get the paper, you get the girl. That's frontier law, boys. A crowd of about a dozen men, miners and drifters with hollow eyes and brutal laughs, gathered around the fire barrel. They looked at Clara not as a human being who was freezing to death, but as a mare up for auction. They looked at her pale, shivering frame, at the wide-set hazel eyes that she fought to keep dry. She would not cry. She had promised herself that when her uncle dragged her out into the snow and traded her for a handful of poker chips, she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. Crying meant they broke you. She looks a bit fragile for washing clothes, Silas, one of the miners sneered, wiping sleet from his beard. What else is she good for? The men laughed. The sound was uglier than the blizzard. Clara squeezed her arms tightly across her chest, her knuckles turning white. Her dignity was the only possession she had left, and they were trying to strip it away for $30. In the darkest corner of the porch, entirely removed from the circle of firelight, a man stood motionless. Naiche did not blend into the shadows. He commanded them. He was Apache, 38 years of hard living etched into the weathered copper of his skin. He wore a faded canvas coat over a wool shirt, leather leggings, and knee-high moccasins that made no sound on the wooden floorboards. He held a dented tin cup in one hand, but he wasn't drinking. His deep-set black eyes were fixed on the girl. He saw what the drunken men missed. He saw the violent trembling she was trying to suppress. He saw the blue tint creeping into her lips, and he saw the fierce, terrified defiance in her eyes. She was a bird caught in a steel trap, bleeding, but refusing to sing for her captors. $20, a voice called out. I said 30, you cheap bastard. Silas spat, pulling the paper from the post and waving it. Look at the ink. It's a legal transfer. She's property now. Merchandise. The word hit Clara like a physical blow. Merchandise. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, the cold sinking deeper into her bones. Then, a sound cut through the murmurs, the heavy, unmistakable clink of gold coins hitting the wooden lid of a barrel. The crowd fell silent. Silas stopped waving the paper. Clara opened her eyes. Naiche stepped out of the shadows. The men instinctively parted, a ripple of genuine unease shifting through the group.
Look at this.
They knew who he was. He was the scout who navigated the frozen canyons, a man who spoke little and missed nothing. He was an immovable wall of quiet authority, and he did not belong in their drunken auction. Naiche walked up to Silas. He did not look at the trader's face. He looked at the 3 heavy gold eagles resting on the bar.
Row.
That's $30, Silas stammered, his bravado evaporating in the sheer gravity of the Apache's presence. Silas swallowed hard and held out the folded debt paper. She's yours. Take her. Clara stopped breathing. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the tall, broad-shouldered man in the canvas coat. He was terrifying in his stillness. He took the paper from Silas's hand. He didn't look at her. He didn't smile triumphantly. He just stared at the ink. Clara braced herself. She waited for him to grab her arm. She waited to be dragged away into the dark, traded from a cruel uncle to a greedy trader, and now to a silent warrior who had just bought her life. Instead, Naiche turned toward the raging fire barrel. Without a word, without a moment of hesitation, he opened his hand and dropped the debt paper directly into the flames. The fire flared orange, consuming the dry paper instantly. The word "sold" curled into black ash and vanished into the winter wind. A collective gasp swept through the men. Silas took a step back, his eyes wide. "Are you crazy? You just burned your claim." Naiche finally spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, quieter than the storm, but somehow carrying more weight. "She is not merchandise," Naiche said. He didn't explain further. He didn't demand respect. He simply turned away from the fire and looked at Clara for the first time. His dark eyes were not predatory. They were calm, steady, and unreadable. "The debt is paid," Naiche said, looking only at her. "You are free." Clara stood paralyzed. The cold was still biting, the wind still screaming, but the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. Free. Out here, in the middle of a blizzard, with no money, no coat, and a dozen men who had just been reminded she was alone. Naiche turned his back on the trading post and began to walk down the steps, heading directly into the howling whiteout of the storm. He did not ask her to follow. He did not look back. Clara looked at Silas, whose greed was already shifting back into calculation as he stared at the gold coins. She looked at the miners, whose eyes were lingering on her undefended frame. Out there in the dark was a blizzard that could kill a man in an hour. But out there was also a man who had just paid a fortune simply to burn her cage. Clara pulled her frayed shawl tighter around her shoulders, stepped off the porch, and walked into the storm behind him. The trading post disappeared behind a wall of white within 30 paces. Clara had known cold before. She'd spent her entire childhood in drafty farmhouses, waking up with frost on her quilt and her breath hanging in the air. But this was not cold. This was violence. The blizzard tore across the open ground at the edge of the pine forest, stinging her face like shattered glass. Ahead of her, Naiche moved through the waist-high drifts with a fluid, maddening ease. He did not walk like a man fighting the storm. He walked like a man who understood it. His dark silhouette was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into a blinding, screaming whiteout. Clara forced her frozen legs to move. The oversized men's boots her uncle had shoved onto her feet that morning felt like blocks of lead. Her foot slipped on a hidden patch of ice, and she stumbled, dropping to her knees in the deep snow. The freezing moisture immediately soaked through the thin blue cotton of her dress. The hem, already caked in mud from the trading post, began to freeze solid, the stiff edges scraping painfully against her ankles. She pushed herself up, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She clutched her frayed grey shawl tighter to her throat, but it was useless against the wind. Her fingers were completely numb, aching with a deep, throbbing pain that signalled the onset of frostbite. She looked up. The dark silhouette of the Apache scout was gone. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of her throat. He had left her. Of course he had left her. He had burned the paper and bought her freedom, but freedom in a frontier blizzard was just another executioner. A man like him, a man built for the wild, would not slow down for a broken, freezing girl he owed nothing to. She took another step, the wind shoving her backward. She fell again, her hands plunging into the snow. The cold was beginning to stop hurting, transitioning into a terrifying, heavy warm. She knew what that meant. Her body was giving up. A shadow fell over her. Clara flinched instinctively, raising her stiff arms to protect her face, expecting the harsh grab of a captor, the brutal reality of the frontier she had been sold to. But no hand struck her. No harsh voice ordered her to her feet. Naiche stood above her. His deep-set black eyes studied her pale, shivering frame, registering the blue tint of her lips and the uncontrollable shaking of her shoulders. He did not look at her with pity, nor with the predatory hunger of the men at the trading post. He looked at her with the practical, calculating gaze of a man assessing a fatal wound. Without a word, Naiche reached for the heavy bone buttons of his faded canvas coat. Clara watched in stunned silence as he stripped the heavy garment off his broad shoulders. Beneath it, he wore only a thick wool shirt, entirely insufficient for a storm of this magnitude. He stepped closer and knelt in the snow beside her. "Lift your arms," his low, resonant voice ordered. It was not a request, but it held no cruelty. Clara was too cold to argue, too weak to resist. She managed to raise her trembling arms. Naiche draped the heavy canvas coat over her shoulders. The shock of it almost made her gasp. The inside of the coat was still radiating the intense, living heat of his body. It smelled of wood smoke, pine needles, and raw, weathered leaf. He pulled the lapels together across her chest, his rough, scarred knuckles brushing briefly against her freezing chin. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the hard, unyielding lines of his face. "Keep it closed," he said, his dark eyes holding hers for a fraction of a second. You'll freeze," Clara managed to stammer, her teeth clicking so hard she feared they would crack. Naiche did not answer. He stood up, turning his back to her. But this time, he did not walk ahead. He repositioned himself directly in front of her, his broad shoulders serving as a physical shield against the biting wind. He began to move again, but his pace had changed. He was no longer gliding effortlessly through the snow. He was stepping deliberately, breaking the deep drifts with his own body to create a clear, shallow path for her oversized boots to follow. He is taking the wind for me, Clara realized, the thought breaking through the haze of exhaustion. He had paid $30 in gold to stop a room full of men from laughing at her. He had burned the only proof that she belonged to anyone. And now, he was giving up his only defense against the storm so she wouldn't freeze to death. Clara ducked her head, tucking her chin into the warm, smoke-scented collar of his coat, and followed the path he carved. They walked for what felt like hours. The pine forest swallowed them, the massive, snow-laden branches blocking out the worst of the wind, but the temperature continued to plummet. The darkness beneath the trees was absolute, save for the faint, ghostly glow of the snow. Clara's legs felt like heavy, waterlogged wood. The frozen mud on the hem of her blue dress cracked and broke with every step, the sharp edges cutting through her thin stockings. She focused entirely on the steady, rhythmic sound of Naiche's moccasins breaking the crust of the snow. He was her anchor. If she lost the sound of his footsteps, she would lose her life. Suddenly, Naiche stopped. Clara bumped into his solid back, too exhausted to halt her momentum. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening to the darkness. Clara held her breath. Over the howling of the wind, she heard it. It was a low, mournful sound, rising and falling in the distance, echoing through the frozen canyons. A wolf howl. Then another joined it, closer this time. A hunting pack. Naiche's hand dropped slowly to the heavy hunting knife strapped to his thigh. Clara tried to take a step closer to him, seeking the safety of his presence, but her body had finally reached its absolute limit. The deep, terrifying numbness washed over her brain. Her knees buckled. The world tilted sideways, the white snow rushing up to meet her face. And then there was only darkness. Returning to consciousness was not a gentle process. It was a sharp, stinging ache that started in Clara's fingertips and burned its way up to her chest. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. Her body jerked with the instinct to fight, expecting the biting wind, the cruel grip of her uncle, or the drunken laughter of the trading post. Instead, she found stillness. The howling of the blizzard was no longer a physical assault tearing at her clothes. It was a muffled, distant roar, blocked by thick, solid stone. She blinked against the sudden, beautiful sting of orange light. A small, expertly built fire crackled a few feet away, feeding on dry pine branches. The heat radiating from it felt like a miracle against her numb skin. Clara realized she was not lying on the snow. She was resting on a thick bed of woven pine boughs, heavily insulated from the frozen ground. And she was entirely wrapped in the heavy, smoke-scented canvas coat. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her muscles protesting with a dull, heavy ache. The frozen mud on the hem of her blue dress had begun to thaw, leaving dark, damp stains near her ankles. Her oversized men's boots were missing. Panic flared briefly before she saw them. Naiche was sitting on the opposite side of the fire. He had positioned himself squarely between her and the cave entrance, a silent, immovable barrier against whatever threats lurked in the dark. He sat cross-legged, the firelight catching the sharp, weathered planes of his jaw and the deep copper of his skin. He held her heavy boots on a stick near the flames, slowly turning them to dry the soaked leather without burning it. Was still wearing only his wool shirt. It was damp with melted snow, clinging to the broad, hard lines of his shoulders. He had carried her. He had carried her through a blinding blizzard, with a pack of wolves somewhere in the dark, wearing nothing to protect himself from the cold, just so she wouldn't freeze. Clara pulled his canvas coat tighter around her throat. In the world she knew, men did not do things for nothing. Her uncle had raised her, fed her, and then sold her the moment the debts piled too high. The men at the trading post had offered gold to own her. Everything was a transaction. Everything had a price. She watched the Apache warrior. He did not look at her with expectation. He did not look at her as if she owed him. In fact, he wasn't looking at her at all. His dark, deep-set eyes were focused on the leather of her boots, his face a mask of complete, untroubled concentration. He was not a buyer examining his merchandise. He was a protector, tending to a survivor. Clara shifted on the pine boughs. The rustle of the dry needles was barely audible, but Naiche's head turned instantly. He did not startle. He simply registered that she was awake. He set her boots down on a warm, flat stone near the edge of the fire pit. Without a word, he reached for a battered tin cup sitting near the coals. He picked it up with a strip of leather to protect his hand from the heat and stood. He moved, Ved with that same impossible silence, crouching beside her. "Drink," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the single word carrying the weight of a command, but lacking any trace of cruelty. Clara reached out from under the heavy canvas coat. Her hands were shaking violently, the skin a pale, bloodless white. Her fingers were so numb, they refused to close properly. She tried to grasp the tin cup, but her grip faltered. Naiche did not sigh. He did not look annoyed. Before the cup could fall, his large, scarred hand closed securely over hers, steadying the tin. His skin was incredibly warm. "Slow," he instructed. Clara brought the cup to her cracked lips. It was melted snow, heated just enough to chase the chill from the throat without burning it. It tasted like wood smoke and pine, and it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. She drank eagerly, the warmth spreading down into her hollow stomach, melting the ice that had settled around her ribs. When she finished, she lowered the cup. Naiche took it from her and moved back to his side of the fire. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the burning pine and the distant, muted scream of the blizzard outside. "The wolves." Clara's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. It hurt to speak. "The snow is too deep," Naiche replied, not looking up as he added another branch to the fire. "They lost the scent. They will hunt easier prey tonight." Clara swallowed hard. She looked down at the canvas coat enveloping her. "You are freezing," Naiche paused. He looked across the fire at her. His black eyes were unreadable, capturing the flickering light of the flames. He looked at the fragile, bruised girl who had refused to cry on the auction block, who had walked into a blizzard rather than beg. "I have survived worse cold," he said simply. It was not a boast. It was a flat statement of fact from a man who had endured the harshest edges of the world. Clara looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time without the lens of terror. She saw the exhaustion hiding in the tight corners of his eyes. She saw the slight, almost imperceptible shiver in his broad shoulders that he was trying to suppress. He was not a stone statue. He was a mortal man who was taking damage so she wouldn't have to. "Thank you," she whispered into the collar of his coat. Naiche gave a single, slow nod. "Sleep. The storm will not break until tomorrow." Clara lay back down on the pine boughs. The stone walls of the cave felt like a fortress. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of fear in her chest began to loosen. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the warrior guarding the door. She felt safe. But as the exhaustion finally pulled her under, a deep, rattling cough tore from her throat. Her chest ached with a sudden, unnatural heat. The cold had let her go, but the damage was already done. From the other side of the fire, Naiche's eyes narrowed, his protective silence sharpening into quiet alarm. The cough tore through the quiet of the cave, harsh and wet, rattling deep in Clara's lungs. She did not wake, but her body twisted restlessly on the bed of pine boughs. The heavy canvas coat slipped slightly from her shoulders, exposing her thin blue dress to the chill of the cavern air. Naiche was beside her before the fabric could touch the stone floor. He knelt, his hand hovering an inch above her cheek. He didn't need to touch her skin to feel the unnatural, radiating heat. The freezing trek through the blizzard had spared her limbs from frostbite, but the biting cold had settled deep in her chest. Her breaths were shallow and rapid, her pale face flushed with a dangerous, feverish red. Naiche's jaw tightened. He gathered a handful of clean snow from near the cave entrance, packing it into a strip of cotton he tore from the hem of his own undershirt. He pressed the makeshift cold compress gently against her burning forehead. Clara let out a soft, fractured sigh, leaning instinctively into the relief of his touch. She murmured something incoherent, her hands clutching blindly at the air until her fingers found the fabric of his sleeve. She held on with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. Naiche did not pull away. He remained kneeling beside her, his large, scarred hand resting near hers, offering a silent anchor in their dark. When her grip finally slackened in sleep, he moved back to his side of the fire pit. To keep himself awake, he drew a small, half-finished block of wood and a hunting knife from the leather pouch at his belt. He began to carve. The rhythmic shk, shk of the steel shaving away the grain was a grounding sound. He was carving a hawk. The wood was old, carrying a natural crack down its center, but he worked with the floor rather than against it. As the wings began to take shape under his blade, the shadows cast by the fire seemed to stretch and twist, pulling him back to a winter 12 years gone. The snow had been deeper then, the wind louder. He remembered the desperate, fading weight of his younger sister in his arms, her small body growing lighter as the cold slowly stole her spirit. He had walked for 2 days, fighting the mountain, fighting the sky, promising her they were almost home. But the mountain had won. When he finally reached the fires of his camp, he was carrying only a memory. Naiche's knife slipped, biting into the flesh of his thumb. A bead of dark blood swelled against his copper skin. He didn't flinch. He didn't wipe it away. He simply stared at the crack in the wooden hawk, the old grief sitting heavy and familiar in his chest, a ghost that never stopped haunting him. He looked across the flames at Clara. She was shivering now, the fever breaking her into violent tremor. He would not let the winter take another one. Not tonight. Not while he had breath in his lungs. Hours blurred into the grey, muted light of approaching dawn. The howling of the blizzard outside had dropped to a low, defeated moan. Clara slowly opened her eyes. Her body felt impossibly heavy, as if she had been beaten with stones, but the crushing, suffocating heat in her chest had subsided to a dull ache. The cool, damp cloth slipped from her forehead as she turned her head. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. Beside it, Naiche was still awake. He had not slept a single moment. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. The hunting knife lay on the stone beside him, next to the carved wooden hawk. But it was his face that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. He didn't know she was awake. For the first time since she had seen him step out of the shadows at the trading post, his guard was down. The mask of the stoic, terrifying Apache scout had slipped. What was left was a man bearing a profound, quiet sorrow. His deep-set eyes were fixed on the glowing coals, carrying a grief so heavy and raw that Clara felt a physical ache in her own chest just witnessing it. He looked like a man who had held the weight of the sky for too long, terrified of what would happen if he let it drop. She realized then that the terrifying silence he wore was not a weapon to intimidate others. It was a shield to protect himself. "You stayed awake," she whispered, her voice rough and weak. Naiche's head snapped toward her. In a fraction of a second, the sorrow vanished, replaced by the impenetrable, watchful calm she recognized. The shift was so fast it was jarring, a testament to a lifetime of hiding his pain from a brutal world. "The fire needed tending," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. It was a lie, and they both knew it. There was enough chopped wood stacked near the entrance to keep the fire burning for days without constant watch. He had stayed awake to watch her, to keep the cloth on her head cold, to pull the heavy coat over her shoulders every time she kicked it off in her fever dreams. Clara pushed herself up into a sitting position, pulling his canvas coat tightly around her neck. She looked at the wooden hawk resting on the stone near the embers. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but it has a crack in the wing." Naiche looked down at the carving, then back at her. "The wood was broken before I started," he said quietly. "You do not throw away something strong just because it carries a scar." The words hung in the quiet air between them, resonating far beyond the piece of wood. Clara looked into his dark eyes, feeling a sudden, intense sting of tears that had nothing to do with the fever. He was looking at her, seeing the bruised, souled, abandoned girl she was, and telling her she was not worthless merchandise to be discarded. Before Clara could find the words to answer, Naiche suddenly went rigid. His hand shot out, extinguishing the remaining embers with a fistful of dirt. The cave plunged into grey, dim shadows. "What is it?" Clara hissed, panic spiking in her chest. "The storm is dying," Naiche whispered, his hand gripping the hilt of his hunting knife as he moved silently toward the cave entrance. "Which means Silas's men can finally follow our tracks." The silence that followed the death of the storm was more terrifying than the howling had been. Naiche crouched near the narrow mouth of the cave, his body perfectly still. Outside, the world had been transformed into a blinding, pristine expanse of white. The morning sun pierced through the heavy branches of the pine trees, reflecting off the fresh snow with a harsh, glaring brilliance. But Naiche was not looking at the light. He was listening. In the freezing, thin air of the mountain, sound travelled with lethal clarity. Clara, sitting in the gloom behind him, heard nothing but the shallow, rapid beat of her own heart. But Naiche's head was tilted, his dark eyes narrowed at the distant tree line. "They are coming," he said quietly, his voice barely a breath. Clara felt a cold dread sink into her stomach, heavier than the chill of the dead fire pit. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling weakly beneath her. The fever had broken, but it had left her drained, her muscles feeling like water. As she moved, the frozen mud on the hem of her blue dress scraped against the stone floor, a harsh, loud sound in the absolute quiet. "Silas?" she asked, her voice tight. "Silas is a coward who prefers the warmth of his whiskey," Naiche replied, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "But he has gold, and gold buys men who are willing to hunt. 5 of them. They are breaking the crust of the snow about a mile down the ridge." Clara moved closer to the entrance, leaning heavily against the rough cavern wall. She looked out at the knee-deep snowdrifts. She knew the brutal math of the frontier. She was weak, sick, and wearing oversized boots that made every step a clumsy effort. Naiche was fast, unburdened, and knew these mountains like the back of his hand. "I will slow you down," she said. It was no. Not a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the dull resignation of a woman who had always been told she was a burden. She expected him to nod, to tell her to hide while he saved himself. It was what any man at the trading post would have done. Naiche turned away from the light and walked back to her. He did not agree with her. He did not offer empty comfort. Instead, he reached down to his thigh and unbuckled the heavy leather sheath of his hunting knife. He pulled the weapon free, a long, brutal piece of frontier steel with a worn bone handle, and pressed it into Clara's trembling hands. Clara stared at the weapon, the metal heavy and cold against her palms. "The fire is dead," Naiche instructed, his tone low and strictly tactical. "There is no smoke to lead them here, and the wind has buried our tracks from last night. Move to the back of the cave. Stay in the deepest shadows. Do not move. Do not cough. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear outside." Clara looked up at him, her chest tightening. "Where are you going?" "They are tracking us by moving up the ridge," he said. "If they find this cave, there is no way out. I am going to give them a different trail to follow." He was going to act as bait. He was going to draw 5 armed bounty hunters away from her hiding place. Clara looked at his thin wool shirt, still damp at the collar. "You can't go out there without a coat. You'll freeze before they even catch you. She frantically grabbed the lapels of the heavy canvas coat he had wrapped around her, trying to pull it off her shoulders. Take it back. Please, Naiche. His large hand closed over her wrists, stopping her frantic movements. His grip was firm, but the calluses on his skin were strangely gentle against her pale hands. The coat is heavy. It will slow me down in the deep snow, he said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I need to be a ghost today. He applied a slight pressure, pushing her hands back against her chest, forcing her to keep the warmth. Keep it. He held her gaze for 1 second longer, a silent, intense promise passing between them in the dark, and then he turned away. He slipped out of the cave entrance, and Clara watched as he deliberately kicked up the snow, leaving a deep, obvious trail that veered sharply away from her sanctuary and headed straight toward the treacherous, rocky incline of the eastern pass. Within moments, the blinding white landscape swallowed his silhouette. Clara was completely alone. She retreated to the furthest, darkest corner of the cave, pulling her knees to her chest. She wrapped the canvas coat tightly around herself, burying her nose in the collar to breathe in the scent of wood smoke and pine. She gripped the bone handle of the hunting knife so hard her knuckles ached. Hours bled into one another. The sliver of sunlight at the cave entrance shifted, stretching into long blue shadows as the afternoon dragged on. The silence was deafening. Without the fire, the terrible cold began to seep back into the stone, creeping up her spine and gnawing at her toes. In the dark isolation, the old, familiar poison of doubt tried to take root in her mind. He left you, a small, cruel voice whispered inside her head. Men always leave when the burden gets too heavy. My uncle did. Why wouldn't a stranger? He gave you the knife so you could finish the job yourself when the cold takes you. Clara closed her eyes, fighting the rising panic. She reached out with her left hand, her fingers brushing against the cold stone of the fire pit, until they found the small, cracked wooden hawk he had carved during the night. She traced the flaw in the wood. You do not throw away something strong just because it carries a scar. His voice echoed in her memory. She opened her eyes, her jaw setting with a fierce, quiet resolve. She killed the doubt. He had not left her to die. He had gone to fight for her. She would not dishonor his sacrifice by falling apart in the dark. Then she heard it. Not the whistle of the wind, not the shifting of ice. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of boots breaking the frozen crust of the snow, and it was not coming from the eastern pass where Naiche had gone. It was Rig. Hat outside. A large dark shadow fell across the blinding white entrance of the cave. Clara stopped breathing. She pressed her back flat against the freezing stone wall, raising the heavy hunting knife in front of her chest, as a man stepped into the gloom. The man standing in the cave entrance was not Silas, but he belonged to the same brutal world. He was broad and heavy-set, wrapped in a filthy buffalo coat that smelled of wet hide and cheap tobacco. He stood silhouetted against the blinding white glare of the snow, his breathing loud and laboured in the thin mountain air. He hadn't drawn his weapon yet. He was simply trying to peer into the pitch-black depths of the cavern, his eyes unadjusted to the gloom. "Damn wind," the man muttered, slapping his gloved hands together. He took a heavy, careless step inside. Clara pressed herself so hard against the rough stone wall, she felt it bruising her spine. Beneath the oversized canvas coat, her heart hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm. She gripped the bone handle of Naiche's hunting knife with both hands, the blade pointed out into the dark. If this were yesterday, standing on the porch of the trading post, she would have surrendered. She would have let her uncle drag her by the wrist. She would have let Silas auction her off like a sack of grain. But yesterday she had been Merc, Handy say. Today she was a survivor who had been handed a weapon by a man who believed she was worth fighting for. She would not be taken back to the auction block. If this man reached for her, she would plunge the frontier steel into his chest. The man took another step, pulling a sulfur match from his pocket. He struck it against the stone wall. The tiny flare of yellow light hissed into the dark, illuminating the small cave. The light washed over the dead fire pit, the bed of pine boughs, and finally it caught the pale, terrified, yet absolutely resolute face of Clara in the corner, holding the massive blade. The bounty hunter blinked, a cruel, yellow-toothed grin spreading across his face. Well, well, look what the storm blew in. He dropped the match and reached down to unholster the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. Come on out of there, girl. Silas is waiting, and I ain't in the mood to get stabbed over a $30 debt. He never cleared the lever. A shadow detached itself from the blinding white light behind him. Naiche did not shout. He did not issue a warning. He moved with a terrifying, absolute silence, closing the distance between the cave entrance and the bounty hunter in a fraction of a second. Clara watched, wide-eyed, as the Apache scout materialized behind the large man. Naiche's left arm snaked around the bounty hunter's thick neck, cutting off his airway and his voice in a single, brutal motion. Simultaneously, Naiche's right hand clamped over the cylinder of the man's revolver, pinning it inside the holster so it couldn't be drawn or fired. The large man thrashed wildly, his boots kicking up dirt and snow, but Naiche was immovable. He anchored his weight, his face a mask of cold, predatory focus, holding the struggling man with the unyielding strength of a vice. The struggle lasted only seconds. The bounty hunter's eyes rolled back, and his heavy body went entirely limp. Naiche did not drop him carelessly. He lowered the unconscious man quietly to the cavern floor, dragging him back out into the snow to ensure the cave remained hidden. When he reappeared in the entrance a moment later, he was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under the damp wool of his shirt. He looked into the shadows, his dark eyes finding Clara. She was still pressed against the wall, the knife raised, her entire body shaking violently from the adrenaline. "It is over," Naiche said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, intentionally soft to break the tension in the air. Clara let out a choked breath. Her knees finally gave out, and she slid down the stone wall to the floor, the heavy knife slipping from her trembling fingers to clatter against the rock. Naiche stepped fully into the cave. "The other four tracked me toward the eastern pass. They found an avalanche zone instead of a ghost." He paused, his gaze dropping to the man outside. "This one was lazy. He stayed behind to search the tree line." Clara nodded, pulling his canvas coat tighter around herself, trying to process the fact that she was still alive. She looked up at him, ready to thank him again, but the words died in her throat. In the dim light reflecting off the snow outside, she saw it. The left side of his wool shirt was torn, the dark fabric heavy and glistening with fresh wetness. It was a dark, spreading stain that smelled sharply of copper. "You're bleeding," Clara said, her voice instantly losing its tremble, replaced by a sharp, sudden clarity. Naiche glanced down at his side, as if he had merely spilled water on himself. "One of them had a rifle on the ridge. The bullet only grazed the ribs. It is nothing." "It is not nothing," Clara said fiercely. She scrambled to her feet, the oversized boots clumsy on the uneven floor. She closed the distance between them, ignoring his imposing height and the terrifying violence she had just witnessed him commit. She stopped right in front of him, reaching out to peel back the torn edge of his wool shirt. Naiche flinched, not from pain, but from the sudden proximity. His hand caught her wrist. His grip was a gentle warning, a boundary erected by a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding the touch of others. "I have survived worse," he repeated, the same flat statement he had used about the cold. "I don't care what you have survived," Clara shot back, her hazel eyes locking fiercely with his dark, unreadable ones. "You are not going to bleed to death in a cave because you are too stubborn to accept help." For a long moment, they stood frozen. The wind whispered outside the entrance. Naiche looked at the fragile, pale girl who had been terrified of her own shadow an hour ago, now standing her ground against him with absolute, immovable authority. Slowly, very slowly, his fingers loosened their grip on her wrist. He let his hand fall to his side, yielding. Clara exhaled a shaky breath. Without hesitation, she reached up and unpinned the frayed grey shawl from around her neck. It was the only piece of clothing she owned that wasn't ruined by mud or snow. She gripped the worn fabric with both hands and pulled, tearing it cleanly down the middle. "Sit down," she ordered. Naiche complied, lowering himself onto the flat stone near the dead fire pit. Clara knelt beside him. She carefully pushed the torn wool aside. The bullet had carved a shallow, ugly groove along his lower ribs. It wasn't fatal, but it was bleeding sluggishly, the crimson stark against his copper skin. She folded the torn half of the shawl into a thick pad and pressed it firmly against the wound. Naiche's breath hitched slightly, his abdominal muscles pulling tight as rock, but he made no sound. To bind the compress, Clara had to lean in close. She reached her arms around his broad, hard torso, pulling the remaining length of the shawl tightly around his chest. The proximity was startling. She could feel the steady, powerful thumping of his heart against her cheek. She could smell the scent of the pine forest and the metallic tang of blood on his skin. For Naiche, the sensation was entirely foreign. He was accustomed to the brutal strikes of enemies and the biting teeth of the frontier. He was not accustomed to the careful, trembling hands of a woman tending to his wounds. He looked down at the top of her head, at the dull brown hair falling out of its pins, and felt a strange, profound tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the bullet graze. Clara tied a tight, secure knot over his uninjured side. She sat back on her heels, her hands stained with his blood. "There," she breathed, looking at her makeshift bandage. "It will hold until we find somewhere safe." Naiche looked at the blood on her pale hands, then up to her wide, tired eyes. The barrier of terrifying silence he had kept between them since the trading post finally cracked. "We leave now," Naiche said softly, his dark eyes holding a warmth she had never seen before. "My cabin is in the valley below. It is safe." The descent into the valley took the rest of the daylight. Even with the blizzard gone, the mountain was a brutal, unforgiving adversary. The fresh snow was waist-deep in the drifts, pristine and treacherous, hiding jagged rocks and sudden drop-offs. Naiche led the way, carving a path through the white expanse with the steady, relentless endurance of a machine. But Clara, following closely in the trench he created, noticed the subtle changes. His pace was slower. His movements, usually fluid as water, carried a rigid stiffness. The makeshift bandage, the torn half of her grey shawl wrapped tightly around his ribs, was a stark, constant reminder that he was bleeding into the freezing air because he had chosen to protect her. Clara dragged her oversized boots through the snow, the frozen, mud-caked hem of her blue dress slapping heavily against her calves. Her muscles screamed in protest, and her lungs burned with the thin, icy air, but she did not complain. She refused to be a burden to a man who was already carrying too much. She pulled his heavy canvas coat tighter around her chin and kept her eyes locked on his broad back. By late afternoon, the jagged, exposed rocks of the mountain pass gave way to a deep, sheltered basin. Here, shielded by a dense, towering ring of ancient pine trees, the wind was completely dead. The silence was profound, unbroken by the howling that had terrorized them for a day and a night. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the slip, now stood a cabin. It was built of thick, dark timber, sitting low to the ground, aggressively sturdy and unadorned. It had no porch for drunken men to gather on. It had no post to nail a debt paper to. It was not a place of commerce. It was a fortress, built by a man who demanded to be left alone by a brutal world. Naiche waded through the final snowdrift and stopped at the heavy oak door. He reached up, pulling a leather latch string, and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, a heavy, solitary sound. Naiche stepped aside, holding the door open, and looked at Clara. He was waiting for her to go in first. Clara hesitated on the threshold. Her entire life had been defined by doors closing behind her, trapping her in rooms where her fate was decided by men counting coins. Stepping into this dark, unknown space required a different kind of courage. She looked at the Apache warrior, at his exhausted eyes and his bleeding side, and she realized there was nothing left in this world for her to fear from him. She crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, smelling of dried sage, old wood ash, and leather. The single room was dark, the windows shuttered tightly against the winter. Naiche moved past her, his boots making no sound on the floorboards. Ignoring his injury, he went straight to the large stone hearth taking up half the far wall. He moved with practiced, economic efficiency, clearing the old ash and stacking fresh kindling from a dry pile near by. He struck a flint, the sharp clack echoing in the quiet room. A tiny spark caught the dry moss. Naiche blew on it gently. Within moments, the kindling crackled and the flames leaped up, biting into the heavier logs. Light flooded the cabin. It was a rich, golden light, chasing the shadows into the corners and illuminating the space. There was a sturdy wooden table, a bed covered in thick, dark wolf pelts, and shelves lined with neat rows of dried provisions and hanging herbs. Everything was impeccably clean, stripped of any unnecessary luxury, yet it radiated an overwhelming sense of security. Clara stood near the center of the room, the snow melting off her boots and forming small puddles on the floor. She slowly unbuttoned the heavy canvas coat and let it slide from her shoulders, holding it carefully in her arms. She looked around the room. There were no chains here. There were no auction blocks. There was no uncle to trade her for a whiskey debt, and no Silas to call her merchandise. The crushing, suffocating weight that had sat on her chest since the moment she was dragged to the frontier, finally, completely, evaporated. She was safe. Naiche stood up from the hearth, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. He looked at her, standing in the middle of his solitary world, clutching his coat. He saw the way her shoulders finally dropped, the defensive tension leaving her. Pine.
I needed that.
He walked to the bed, picked up one of the heavy, dark wolf fur blankets, and carried it to her. He took his canvas coat from her hands and draped the thick, incredibly warm fur over her shivering shoulders. "The cold is outside now," Naiche said quietly. Clara looked up at him. She saw the dark, wet stain seeping through the grey shawl wrapped around his torso. The adrenaline of the mountain pass was wearing off, and the sheer physical toll of the last 24 hours was carved deeply into his features. She pulled the fur blanket tightly around herself, the heat of it sinking instantly into her frozen bones. "You need to rest," Clara told him, her voice steady, stripped of the trembling fear that had haunted it for days. "You need to sit down, Naiche. Now." It was an order, spoken with the firm, quiet dignity of a woman claiming her place in a room. Naiche looked at her for a long moment, a flicker of something profoundly warm passing through his dark, unreadable eyes. He did not argue. He did not offer a stoic refusal. He simply nodded, turning slowly to lower his heavy frame into the wooden chair beside the roaring fire. The storm outside the cabin walls was a memory, replaced by the deep, absolute stillness of the hidden valley. Inside, the fire roared in the stone hearth, casting dancing golden light across the dark timber walls and pushing the freezing chill into oblivion. Clara moved through the small space with a quiet, deliberate purpose. She found a heavy iron basin on a lower shelf, filled it with fresh snow from just outside the door, and set it on the iron grate over the fire to melt. From a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, she retrieved clean, folded linen. She turned back to Naiche. He was still sitting in the heavy wooden chair beside the hearth, bathed in the firelight. He watched her every movement, his dark, deep-set eyes unblinking, following her not with the possessive gaze of a captor, but with the quiet wonder of a man observing a miracle in his own home. Clara knelt beside his chair. The makeshift bandage, the torn half of her grey shawl, was stiff with dried blood. "Let me," she said softly. Naiche did not protest. He remained perfectly still as her pale, trembling fingers carefully untied the knot. She pulled the ruined fabric away, tossing it into the fire. She took a cloth, dipped it into the warm water from the iron basin, and began to clean the wound along his ribs. The bullet graze was shallow, but the skin around it was bruised a deep, angry purple. As the warm water washed away the blood, Naiche let out a long, slow breath. The rigid tension that had locked his muscles since the trading post finally began to seep out of him. Clara worked in silence. She felt the raw, hard power of his chest beneath her hands, the scars of old battles and harsh winters mapping the copper skin. This was a man who had been broken by the world in his own ways, who had built a fortress of isolation to survive it. Yet, he had stepped out of the shadows, drawn a weapon against 5 men, and bled in the snow, all for a girl he did not know. She bound his ribs with the clean linen, tying it securely. When she finished, she did not immediately pull away. Her hands lingered on his chest, her thumbs lightly brushing the warm, steady pulse of his heart. Naiche looked down at her. The impenetrable mask was entirely gone. He reached toward a small leather pouch resting on the table beside him. From it, he drew the wooden carving he had worked on in the freezing cave, the hawk. He held it out to her, his large, calloused hand dwarfing the small piece of wood. Clara took it carefully. Her fingers traced the grain, feeling the smooth curve of the wings and the deep, natural crack that ran down the center of the bird's back. When Silas held the paper, Naiche's voice broke the silence, low and resonant. "He called you merchandise. He put a price on a human soul." Clara looked up from the carving, her breath catching at the raw emotion in his tone. "I did not give him gold to buy you, Clara," Naiche continued, speaking her name for the very first time. "Im." It sounded entirely different on his tongue, deliberate, reverent, stripped of any cruelty. "I gave him gold to burn the paper, to burn the lie. A life cannot be owned." He leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the profound sincerity in his dark eyes. "The winter is harsh, and the pass is closed," he said, his voice steady. "But when the spring comes, and the snow melts, you are free to leave this valley. You can go wherever you wish. No one will ever hunt you. I will make sure of it.
Clara looked at the cracked wooden hawk in her hands, then back at the Apache warrior who had sacrificed everything to hand her back her freedom. She thought about the world outside this valley. She thought about her uncle, the trading post, the cold, empty transactions that made up the frontier. Then she looked at the roaring fire, at the sturdy timber walls, and finally at the man sitting in front of her. A man who spoke in actions, who shielded her from the wind, who gave her his coat, and who stayed awake so she could sleep. She placed the wooden hawk gently on Naiche's knee. "What if I don't want to leave when the spring comes?" Clara asked, her voice quiet but entirely steady. Naiche went perfectly still. He stared at her, the breath trapped in his chest. "Clara." "I was sold," she said,